Welcome to another episode of Pop Goes Illegal, and it's also kind of a crossover with Objection. Been doing a lot of these recently because it seems like a lot of pop culture right now is these true crime docs, really. We're joined today by Francisco Mundaca. He's the founder and managing partner of the Mundaca Law Firm, where he represents clients in labor and employment, business law, consulting, and crisis management across multiple states. Known for his litigation experience and practical counsel, he advises executives, professionals, and businesses on complex legal matters. Today, we're going to be talking about Amy Bradley is Missing. Thank you so much, Francisco, for coming on.
Yeah, thank you both for having me. I'm excited to be part of the podcast, and hopefully I can give you some answers and something to talk about.
We always like to start here by kind of breaking down like kind of what's happening, right? And for this, it's the documentary. So I'm going to throw to Raquel if you could explain a bit what the documentary is, because I know we both really binged it last night to make sure we were ready.
Yeah, so it's a three-part docu-series that basically goes into the disappearance of Amy Bradley, who disappeared when she was, I think, 23 years old. And she was on a cruise ship. She was out one night late, and then the next morning, her father sort of saw her sleeping on a chair 1 hour, and then an hour later, she was missing, and they didn't know where she was. And then the docu series sort of goes into alternative theories about what might have happened to Amy. Some people initially thought that she jumped off the ship or she fell overboard and she died. However, her body was never found. There was never any body parts that were found in the water.
I found a jawbone, if I'm not mistaken, that they thought could have been Amy Bradley's. Francisco, is that right? Do you remember if it was like a like a human jawbone?
Yeah, so there's this jawbone they've apparently tried to link to various cases, and so they've cross-referenced this jawbone with several missing persons, and it's yeah, who knows, right? But
Okay, so there's a jawbone that might be Amy's. I guess I tuned out for that part of the documentary. And then there's sort of two other main theories that the series was exploring. One was this man that was on the ship that there was a video of Amy dancing with. His name was Alistair Yellow, was his nickname, Douglas. And it sort of goes into what might have happened with him. There was eyewitnesses that said that they saw them go up to the disco, which was closed at a certain time, before she was noted missing. And then there was sort of a third theory that she sort of left the ship. She's still alive and she was either sex trafficked. And, there were sort of eyewitnesses that they've pulled through that have noted that they met someone who they believe was Amy Bradley in Barbados and I think in Curacao. So the documentary sort of in each of the episodes goes through these different theories of what might have happened. And then throughout the series also introduces us to friends and family that were in Amy's life that sort of lend a supportive theory as to why this might be the case of what happened with her, but ultimately she's still missing.
I guess first question, Francisco. Obviously, Hugh commented on the document in that Lad Bible article. What did you think of the docu series?
I'll tell you, they're so well made, and they're really geared towards being thought provoking. So when you get all these tidbits of information from different areas, from the taxi driver who said that she knocked on his window, and then there's the subsequent sightings. I thought it was great. Ultimately, what you could hope is that this renewed interest would ultimately lead to someone finding her and her being able to rejoin her family. Because lost in all this fascination is that there is someone who's missing, and hopefully not, still with us in some capacity. But it's really tragic circumstances when you look at it.
With your background in crisis management, is it also probably likely that as much as it gives the family hope and maybe renews interest, it's also going to kind of bring out these false theories. Hey, I saw Amy in San Francisco. I saw Amy. She's in Boston. She's just like all over the map. I assume for all the good, there's also equal bad to that, right?
That's right. I mean, anytime now, I think with the advent, especially of how things become viral, you get so many tips, and it's hard to process through every single one of them. I mean, look no further than I think when Busby brought that civil action, and they had hotlines against Sean Combs, and there were hotlines. There's thousands upon thousands of calls, and being able to determine which one is accurate and which one actually has legs is hard to do, and it requires a lot of resources. So you hope that you can parse through all that information, but it's tough.
So for something like this, let's kind of go back to 1998. Obviously, different time, like completely different time, especially for travel. How would you approach like a case like this, or like something like this happening where she seemingly in half an hour has fallen off the face of the planet?
Yeah, I mean, it depends which hat am I wearing. As a former prosecutor, if I was part of that team, looking at this from, of course, the law enforcement lens, and you ultimately time is everything. Time is of the essence. Never holds more true. Basically, from my understanding, again, we're getting all this secondhand, and there's some kind of firsthand interviews, but when the family approached the cruise ship, so roughly at 7 a.m., and they told them to come back 30 minutes later just to check in because I think they didn't want to perform an all call and wake up all the passengers, even though everyone was disembarking shortly thereafter. That kind of time is crucial because let's assume that the narrative where she didn't fall off balcony or jump. Uh, you know, being able to screen passengers as they exit is, I mean, once they're dispersed into Curacao, I mean, how do you put that genie back in the bottle?
Yeah, it seems like they kind of fall, like they can go anywhere from Curacao. That's kind of the where the trail goes cold, essentially.
That's right. That's right. And so if I'm prosecuting or part of the legal law enforcement side, that's what I'm looking at: evidence, interviews, timing, because you have to build out a chronology. Now, if I'm the civil practice and I'm being retained subsequent, maybe I'm trying to being retained by the family to bring an action. Well, this is where this case gets really interesting from a legal perspective because you've got the flag state where the boat is licensed, which was Bulgaria. So that's, kind of an interesting and, what laws apply there. And we can certainly jump into that too, but you've got port side of laws where Curacao, you know, you're not in international waters yet. I believe there's like 12 miles. We can certainly go into that, but you've got then the U.S. citizen aspect where the U.S. may potentially want to have jurisdiction. And so you've got a lot of this tangled web that makes it really complicated in this particular case.
In your opinion, then who who's responsible? I know obviously the family filed that civil suit, and if I'm not mistaken, it was dismissed, and another one was it settled like privately or confidentially?
That's right. Yes. And so who's responsible is a really tough question. Ultimately you start with the cruise ship, right? They had a duty to inspect. Now, whether that rose to the level of actual cognizable claim is another question. And since it was dismissed, it seems like the court didn't agree. But that could have been, I haven't looked closely at that case to determine what was the reason for the dismissal, whether it was jurisdictional, because that could be the case here, or the fact that he was legally announced dead, but she's still categorized as missing by the FBI. So there's, again, I really think depends on the lens that you're looking at it from. But
Without, for lack of a better phrase, like Amy herself or like the body of Amy, is there really anything that could be done? Like how would this work in court with there's no proof that technically Royal Caribbean did anything wrong or the ship did anything wrong because no one knows what happened to her? Is that kind of the issue that I guess they're bumping up into?
yeah, well, from the civil side, it's a negligence aspect. They have a duty to act. And here, the question is, did they do enough? Because ultimately they didn't screen. I think everyone disembarked, and then they started searching the entire ship. And what was kind of surreal to me is the size of this. Now, it's not quite the Titanic. It's 11 stories high. It's hard as I hear 1,000 feet. And this is why I'm not an accountant. I'm like numbers. I'm like, okay, 1,000 feet, pretty cool. But what is 1,000 feet? And 1,000 feet apparently is the Eiffel Tower, the Chrysler. So if you laid across, they had about 900 people searching this ship, and they go room to room, closet to closet. What's interesting is that they actually have crew members search their own rooms. Now, let's play, something conspiracy theory here, right? You have a potential tie-in to Alistair. You are assuming that there isn't another crew member involved. Let's just say we're going down the narrative of trafficking, right? Now you've got crew members who have to search their own rooms. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a rabbit hole, right? And we're purely speculating, but it's fascinating, when you think about it that way.
Yeah, I investigated myself and I found I did no wrong. That's like the classic joke.
When I was watching that episode, sorry, and the and the director of the cruise ship, I think it was saying that, they didn't want to sort of do their all hands on deck, everyone search the room, that procedure that, that they have in place for situations like this right away. I was like, that's weird. Like, why would they not do that right away? And then he was sort of saying, like, you have, I think it was like, I forget the number of people, but like thousands of people on the ship who've paid for the cruise and paid to disembark. And it's like, how do you balance those two interests? On one hand, like, someone might be missing, and this is like, could be a pretty serious case and ultimately resulted in a pretty big disappearance that was captured by like national television and held like, the nation's interests. But at the other hand, you have all these like paying customers who, you know, they want to disembark and they want to go bet on their trip. I mean, I think in hindsight, if they knew that this would blow up the way that it did and someone missing and a family was affected in such a horrible way, maybe they would have just done the inspection the way it should have been. So like, hopefully now, like cruise ships, if a situation happens like this ever again, they've learned from this mistake. And, if someone is flagged missing, even after a half hour, like hopefully cruise ships have now sort of said like, well, we don't want another situation like this. Like we should really, do our duty and we should do the inspection right away.
Yeah, and cruise ships themselves have changed dramatically. I mean, we're going back years now, right? Now, I believe they had surveillance footage in main areas, so living at, big lounge areas, restaurants. But now cruise ships, I believe, have cameras in the hallways. Of course, they can't place them in the rooms for privacy reasons, but it would be a lot harder to do now, for this to happen now. The laws have changed a little bit too, and there's better protocols in place in terms of timing. But, normally if a US citizen goes missing, the FBI has to be notified immediately. Now, there was a huge investigation. And so to your point, it's the timing. You would hope that the crews would act. You would hope that they would move quickly. But, when I was looking at one of the things that stood out to me in the documentary was that, so the cruise ship notified the chief of police in Curacao, and then they immediately started a search, which is great. But from what I saw, they focused on the water, and they're focusing on her jumping or falling over. They couldn't find, which is where they said something would have washed up or sharks, and even they brought that factor in, which is all very real. It's the question is now, when they dispersed on land, you've got 2,000, maybe even up to 2,500 people walking around. Now they're blending in with the residents of the country. And so that's just hard. If you don't have a team ready to sort of screen on the dock as people walk by, and like they're looking at large suitcases, or you're tipping up caps to get visual confirmation, I don't know what you do. I mean, it's tough.
So it sounds like to me that's kind of where you think that first initial mistake was, right? Is that they waited so long, and then when they did tell, Curacao police, the Curacao police focused on the water. They weren't doing screens at the docks, and then after that, as you mentioned, you said the genie's out of the bottles. Is that kind of what I'm getting?
Absolutely. And I think that not until after that was the FBI notified. And I believe they were stationed in St. Martin. I could be wrong on that location. And they had to travel to Curacao to start the investigation. But then what's even more, so dovetailing back to where we started, the preservation of evidence. So the room where the Bradley stayed in was already cleaned. So they wiped the railing, the fingerprints are gone. Again, sheets were changed. It's just a disaster from an investigative point of view. It really is. It's like the last thing that you ever want to happen as an investigator, is that things are sterilized and moved.
Yeah, and that's where conspiracy creeps in, right? Because you have all these things that seemingly are innocuous on their own, but like, gosh, they didn't screen at the dock. They clean their rooms. Unfortunately, it's a reality, but like human trafficking sounds more likely because all these things are happening. Like, oh gosh, it seems like it's a cover up. X, Y, and Z are in on it. Yellow is the ringleader. All of these things sort of creep in because there's just these gaps in the investigative process.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it does lend more credence to that conspiracy theory that there's more than one individual involved. And I think to pull off something like this where someone is trafficked, there has to be, right? There's a person touring. There's a lot of layers to this. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it's certainly some troubling to say the least.
So I mean, let's get into I guess the theories, right? Raquel, I know you broke them down in brief, but could you just kind of go over them one more time?
Well, the sex trafficking I thought was like the biggest conspiracy theory. I mean, talking about it and like watching it on the like watching the episodes, it seems like the theory of Alistair, who was yellow, is that like he sort of coordinated for her, I don't know, like kidnapping, I guess, so that she could be trafficked. I think it started when there was a few eyewitnesses. I think the first eyewitness said that they saw her in um, Barbados, someone who was on like a swimming or diving trip of some sort of saw her picture afterwards and it's like, I saw this woman on the island, and recognized she had a Tasmanian devil tattoo on her shoulder, and he recognized the tattoo, and he was sort of able to say like, oh, I saw this woman, she's alive, she's on this island. And then after that, I think her family went to the island and was sort of driving through, and the brothers like, I could have swore I heard you know, her say my name while I was driving through this like field, and then ultimately like pulled over the car, and it was just like an old man by himself. And then afterwards a few different eyewitnesses came forward after that. One of which was a retired Navy officer who said that he saw her in a brothel, and she sort of confessed to him when everyone else was, left the table, and it's like, my name is Amy Bradley, like I'm missing and I need to get out of the situation. I owe them $200. And he sort of didn't report it until years later because of his own, he was afraid it would affect his ranking when he retired from the Navy. And then the third eyewitness was a woman who I believe also was in Barbados, saw her in a bathroom and was watching Dr. Phil and saw her parents talking about the disappearances. Like, oh, I recognize this woman. I saw her in a bathroom in Barbados. She was with men. They seemed to be pressuring her to do something that she didn't want to do. And then I think the ultimate, crux or the ultimate hook that made her parents believe that she was truly being sex trafficked was this anonymous picture that they got of a woman who resembled Amy, sort of in a provocative photograph. And the FBI did a forensic analysis on the picture. They compared the ear size, they compared the jaw, they did a rendering of what Amy would look like after 7 years of her missing, and they sort of concluded that the woman in the picture could be Amy. So the documentary sort of goes into, you know, was she sex trafficked? And I think it's goes to your point, Zach, to what you said before about how these gaps in the investigation sort of gave the family hope that she's still alive and she's still out there.
But it seems she was legally pronounced dead in 2010. I know the family just seemingly can't move on, and it is because these gaps. Suddenly, there's time where Amy could have, left the cruise ship and could be in Curacao. And again, these tips keep coming in. This woman looks like Amy Bradley. That just keeps giving this family like a tinge of hope, really. And for better or worse, hope is the great equalizer. It's great, and it's also the thing that can destroy you as like a parent who lost a child. Yeah, so I think that really is its gaps in the investigation.
Yeah, no, the human element to this case. I mean, not being able to heal. I mean, the poor family, right? They've held on hope for years, and then suddenly there's this renewed interest, probably new tips. I'm sure they're getting emails and phone calls still. And yeah, how do you ever heal and move on? I don't know if you ever move on from something like that, but this certainly doesn't help. all you can do is hope that it does lead to something positive or at least some form of closure for them.
When the brother who said that, I think he was like 50 now or so, you know, he's a little bit older. And he was like, I can have children. He can't move on with his life because he saw how losing a kid affected his parents. So I think the human element of it all is what makes the documentary so interesting.
Yeah, and from what I understand, I mean, the brother's still very much out, front and center. That's his way of keeping this in the new and social media's eyes and in the news. And because the second that it's sort of the news cycle, right? The next big story comes and the next big documentary, then all these things sort of quiet down, and then you never really hear about it again. The resources aren't being placed, because you ultimately can't have a team of people tied into one case for a long time. There has to be, look at the Gilgo Beach killer. That things just with time they quiet down unless something new comes to light, and then there's a renewed interest and efforts placed from law enforcement perspective.
Yeah, and then I think it's important to mention again the documentary kind of leans heavily into this trafficking aspect, right? But there's also the obvious one, which is her dad saw her what 5:30, and then she was gone at 6. She could have fallen over. She could have either done it accidentally or on purpose. And from that height, I think I saw it was like 90 feet, and the ship is traveling, I believe it was 20 knots, which is 23 miles an hour. It's the equivalent of like jumping on the concrete from that height at that speed, and hitting the water. So it's very likely, though, even though I think the argument is she was a strong swimmer, but I think when you hit hit the concrete, it may not make a difference.
Right, right. Yeah, I remember one part of the documentary where the investigator was saying, I think he was 6'4", and the railing reached up to about the mid level of his chest. I mean, that to fall over at that height is unlikely. If she did jump, that's more likely. If the result was her ending up in the water, momentum, even in an intoxicated state, if the railing is that high, it just physics won't allow you to just tip over. So in this case, it is more likely that she jumped over falling over. Um, and then what we tend to see is, and you've both seen, I'm sure, there's horrible things that happen all the time. And then there's times where parents or loved ones are like, yeah, I could see it, or they were pretty troubling. And there's some like, I had no idea that there was this other side of it. So, she seemed to be very well liked, but she was going through, a period where I think her father, her parents weren't agreeing with her romantic choices at the time. And, who knows what she was going through internally. But I think, the fact that the investigation, to your point, has so many gaps, I mean, you're left wondering, did she jump? Did is that realistic? So yeah, it's upsetting no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings up my next point is I guess let's talk about the 1998 of it all, which is again you mentioned it. Her father, the 1998 things were different then, and it's that again her father didn't approve of her relationship choices. She had a girlfriend. He wanted them to pretend like they had boyfriends, and of voices out there that kind of express their concern with pointing the finger at Yellow Douglas, Alistair Yellow Douglas, because again, he is a black man. It is 1998. He's dancing with a white woman from the States, and there is just this concern that maybe, hey, there is no real evidence against him. He was dancing with a woman. He's literally hired by the cruise ship, and now suddenly he's the ringleader of this trafficking ring. Um, and again, I'm not saying that's necessarily again true or not, but I'm curious as a prosecutor now looking at this, 27 years later, is that like ring true at all? That these may have been just byproducts of their time, and these could have unduly influenced the investigation in any way?
I mean, it's a really interesting point. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that maybe that it had a role. It's easy. It's like what at at that time people looked at as like that's the easy answer. And when you run with an idea, and I think a lot of law enforcement, you hear about tunnel vision. You get this idea and you start charging for it, and you're missing everything else. It's You're right. 98 was a totally different time. I mean, different technology, different culture, different ideas. Uh, and it's. Well, I think when you're looking at a case from 98, you look at what the technology was like. DNA is so much better now than it was then. Cameras are, investigations are done differently, because, law enforcement learns. And so, with her case, you tend to think that it does, race and, how they looked at it. Did that have a role, or did her, her relationship choices have a role? I don't know. And I, ultimately you think that as an investigator, that you've got to sort of quiet that noise down. But, I think the reality is people are human by nature and not everyone is the same. And so while you'd like to give someone the benefit of the doubt that they were conducting investigations in the proper fashion, maybe not.
Yeah, obviously you weren't involved in the investigation. You can't say, but I think it is worth mentioning because it is what a lot of people point out is like so much time was spent on Alistair Yellow Douglas that like maybe something else was missed. Again, another gap, right? At the end of the day, they can't charge him, and they've spent so much time on trying to get something out of him from them dancing the night previous that like, hey, maybe this was nothing. Maybe we put all of our eggs in this one basket, and now Amy is completely gone.
Well, I mean, let's put our criminal defense hat on for a moment. So there was people that viewed them, saw them dancing. He passed a polygraph test. Now, while that's not admissible in New York, it may be in certain jurisdictions, but he's going down the road where what else do you have to do to show that you're innocent? Really there's stories about maybe him being on the beach with her, and there's eyewitness sightings, but at some point you have to back off that theory and say, okay, well, we don't have any other reason to think that he was part of it. Now, he's maybe the most likely based on timelines, but that's not enough. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. They've got to prove that, and they haven't. They haven't been able to, or else he would have been arrested.
This documentary kind of hit a nerve with like your true crime junkies, right? I'm just curious about like your thoughts on like these sort of true crime documentaries, their responsibility to the families, right, and their responsibility to the investigation, right? Because they breathe new life into it for better or for worse. So I'd love to hear your kind of take on this genre that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that you could spend like an hour just talking about that. I mean, it's double-edged sword, right? So on one end, you've got these revived cases. They see new life. Maybe there's more hope. And they generate new leads, and the authorities are pressured to maybe reopening the case and investing more resources. But on the other, you have witness testimony that can be tainted. You've got some misinformation to parse through. And then you eventually it hinders the investigations in and of itself. I remember times as a prosecutor where if I was working on a case, I would see the story in the newspaper completely wrong and wonder where the information came from. Of course, it's an eyewitness, or maybe it's someone who's speculating, but that's really damaging. And I can actually vividly recall a moment where I was indicting a homicide, and you do not want, I mean, it's a secret proceeding. So I was going before the grand jury, and you don't want anything out. And then there's this whole story where there's this completely new, different narrative. You're like, well, that actually didn't happen. But, I think they're important. I think these documentaries are important because at the very least, there is a small chance that someone finds her, or we can determine, or one way or another, right? And then on the other side, of course, there's the low hanging fruit. It is entertainment, right? That's why there's a lot of money placed into these things. Of course, there's the genuine side of it, but these companies like Netflix, they know they're going to attract a lot of viewers and then subsequent conversation, and then so there's a lot. I think there's more positives than negatives, but ultimately, I think what's important here is like, what is the family thing? Do they want this? mean, they were interviewed, so maybe on some level they do. But I think it's a double-edged sword ultimately.
It's funny, like throughout this conversation, also when we were like talking about the gaps and other parts of the documentary, I just kept thinking the family must want this because they were interviewed, they agreed to do the documentary, but at the same time, I feel like, and maybe it's just like the pessimist in me, I feel like people are going to be calling, and there could be people with bad intentions calling, giving these hints, and it's just breathing new life, and it continues to give hopes to the families that you might still be alive. And I feel like it's you want to put this piece of content out there because you want to have this conversation, you want to hopefully get a tip, you want to get some good news, you want people to have these conversations about protocols that are in place when someone goes missing on a cruise ship, hopefully change what could happen to someone else who might go missing. But at the same time, like it's just so fearful that you could be getting all this false hope and you could be getting these tips, and it just could be someone leading you in circles or leading you in the wrong direction.
And yeah, again, I think that kind of you look at kind of the witnesses. These are like the who's who of unreliable witnesses, right? And I don't know how much I necessarily trust the testimony, and other people again who just want to be helpful, right? And I think a lot of that, again, because we're talking about kind of the double-edged sword. Obviously, there's bad actors out there, but a lot of people are just trying to be helpful. They want so badly to be helpful to the family and get reunite Amy and their family, but second, be a part of the story, right? They want to be a part of this kind of like narrative, and they want to be like, oh, I'm the person who found Amy. I cracked the whole thing wide open. Um, so again, I definitely think double-edged sword, especially for a family who seemingly wanted this or seemingly want to be a part of this.
So true, so true. I'm fascinated by it. Honestly, I think that the documentaries and the internet sleuths, some of the things they're doing are amazing. I mean, let's say like the Willie Petito case where they had footage and they linked it and they saw. I mean, that's like real detective work.
If people want to find you, want to learn more about your firm, where can they go?
Yeah, no, thank you. My firm, the website is www.mundacalaw.com. And, it's very interactive. If you want to set up some time to chat with me, you can certainly reach out through there. Maybe not so much about Amy Bradley too often, though. but yeah, no, that's the best way.
Be careful. They might have to set up a tip line on your website. Um, well, thank you again.
Thank
Thank you
you.
both. I appreciate it.
For more on all things real estate and the law, subscribe to this and our other podcasts. Follow Bergstein, Flynn, Knowlton, and Polino on social media. Subscribe to our newsletter and go to bfklawoffice.com. That's bfklawoffice.com to learn more.